All right, well, good afternoon and welcome to our final Zoom session for PPA 500. This is our seventh and final session. So I'm glad Judy and Liz, you're here tonight. Hopefully some of your colleagues will arrive as well. Last week, there are only two or three of us. And so hopefully some of your colleagues will trickle in as we get started tonight. Let me make sure that I'm recording. Yep, we are recording. So this is our last Zoom session. And so just as a reminder, you have two more assignments remaining. You have your final beach board essay assignment that is then due by midnight on the 14th, next Monday. For that one, what you're doing is you're taking some of the information we talked about back when we talked about public policy analysis. Specifically, you're going to take that information on decision-making models. And if you remember back when we talked about policy making, we introduced four different decision-making models: rational comprehensive, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and garbage can model of decision making. And so what I'm asking you to do in this final beach board posting is to select a policy that you're familiar with or a policy that you're interested in, and look at how that policy was formulated in terms of the type of decision-making model that you think was used in the creation of the formulation of that public policy. So a good place to start would be to start with just the general policy area. So if you're interested in education policy, or if you're interested in housing policy, or criminal justice policy, think of a general broad policy area, and then within that policy area, find one specific policy and focus on that one specific policy and discuss how it was formulated in terms of, was a rational comprehensive decision-making type of process? Was it a much more incremental in that the policy today looks a lot like the policy looked over the past several years? Is it kind of a combination of rationality and incrementalism with that mixed scanning type of model of decision-making? Or is it more of a garbage can model, what we talked about with this confluence of the right participants and the problem and the solution, which is oftentimes pre-existing, and a choice opportunity that then allows us to put everything together and create or formulate that policy? So what decision-making model is used in the creation of that policy? And then if you think there's another decision-making model that would be superior to the decision-making model that was used in creating the policy, offer that up as well. And let me know that, well, they seem to just take an incremental approach to this policy, but I think a garbage can model, or I think a rational comprehensive approach might be more appropriate in this situation. So that's your final beach board essay. As always, you'll have your initial response to that prompt, and then you'll also respond to two of your classmates. So that's then due. All three of those posts have to be in no later than midnight on March 14th, next Monday. And then the last assignment you have is to finish up that final assessment. We talked about the final assessment, and I took you through all the different scenarios and questions on that final assessment. So that final assessment then is due by midnight next Tuesday, March 15th. Then once you turn in that final assessment, then you are finished with the course. All your work will be done, and you can then move onward and upward to, if you have a second half hybrid course, move in that second half hybrid course, or at least getting this course finished early will then allow you to have more time to devote to any other courses that you are taking. So as of next Tuesday, March 15th, we will be finished. Now, we're not going to have a live Zoom session next Tuesday. Tonight is our final live Zoom session, so do make a note of that. Once I get your assignments next Tuesday, I'll go ahead and do the final grading. I am out of town from the 13th until the 16th, so I won't be coming back in town until next Wednesday. But as soon as I hit town next Wednesday, I will grade those final assignments, grade your last beach board, grade your final assessment, and hopefully be able to have all your grades done and ready to be submitted, if everything goes well, by next Thursday. Sometimes university forgets that we are a hybrid course, and so they won't open up the grading window for me right then. But if the grading window is not open next Thursday, I'll contact who I need to contact and get it open so I can get your final grades posted for you. So that will then wrap up our class time together. Okay. Any questions or anything on wrapping up those last two assignments? Okay, between now and next Tuesday, as you work on the final assessment, if you do have any questions that emerge, feel free to send me an email, even though I'm going to be out of town from the 13th to the 16th. I'll obviously have access to email, and so I'll be able to respond to you. It's just my responses may be a little bit slower next Sunday and Monday than they are normally. So just give me a few hours to respond, but feel free to send me an email with any questions you may have. I think most folks did really well on the midterm assessment, and so the structure of the final assessment is just like the midterm assessment. The expectations are exactly the same as on the midterm assessment. So if you can just do what you did on the midterm assessment, I'm sure you will do very well on the final assessment as well. So in terms of the material left for us to cover, I've decided that for tonight, my goal is just to finish the material for the final assessment. So I want to make sure we go through all the material that will allow you to answer all 5 scenarios on that final assessment, which means that tonight what we're going to do is we're going to finish up our discussion of the management of resources. Because again, that's what public administrators do. They spend most of their time managing human resources and managing fiscal resources. So those will be the 2 primary topics for tonight. Where we left off our discussion last week is we talked about the development of public employment, especially the development of public employment at the federal level of government. We identified the 3 main eras of public employment: era of gentlemen, spoils, and merit. We talked about why we transitioned from gentlemen to spoils and why we transitioned from spoils to merit. We talked about the piece of legislation that underpinned the era of merit, things like the Pendleton Act of 1883, the Hatch Act, the Civil Service Reform Act in 1978. And then we talked about how our current era of merit gives us this career civil service system. At the federal level, the career civil service system is all organized around this position classification system known as the general schedule. And I took you through the different levels, grade levels in the general schedule. We said the general schedule is what's known as a step and column system. Most state governments and local governments will have their own step and column systems that kind of operate in a similar fashion to the general schedule at the federal level. So we'll have different grade levels, and positions will then be situated in these different grade levels based upon the requirements of the job and the types of duties and tasks that are done on a daily basis in each one of those jobs. So we identified, if you come out with a master's degree in MPA and you go into the federal service, career civil service, chances are you're probably going to start somewhere around the GS-11 or GS-12 level if you have a graduate level degree, which then puts you in a good position to relatively quickly move into the GS-13 to 15 levels, which are those top level supervisory positions just beneath the senior executive service. And we talked about the creation of the senior executive service, why it was created, and then some of the flaws in the way in which Congress created it. We talked about advantages and disadvantages of career civil service. And so, this is something you're going to be talking about on the final assessment. The advantages of the career civil service: you have protection from arbitrary dismissal, you have protection from political influences, so you can really focus on doing your job as well as you can do it. We can really focus on making sure people are hired and retained and rewarded based upon their merit, their qualifications, and their ability and their demonstrated ability to do the job. The disadvantages, obviously, of the career civil service is we don't have the same ability as our private sector counterparts to give extrinsic rewards to our employees. It's tougher for us to do pay for performance because we are really constrained by these position classification levels in the general schedule. And so just because someone's performing well on the job, we can't offer them bonus pay. For them to get paid more, their position probably would need to be reclassified to a higher classification level, which would then come with extra additional compensation. The problem is when you start reclassifying jobs, You should only reclassify a job because the nature of that job has changed. You should not reclassify a job just to try and monetarily reward the incumbent in that job. So also, when you start reclassifying these jobs, it's kind of a cascading effect. It's a snowball effect, because once you reclassify these jobs, then people in other jobs and other classification levels are going to want their jobs reclassified as well so that they can get paid more money, and so on and so on. So it's kind of a self-perpetuating type of prophecy when you start reclassifying positions in a position classification system like the general schedule. And then we said, so as managers, as public managers, when we are managing our human resources, we need to be cognizant of these career civil service protections that are afforded to our employees. But overlay on top of those protections, protections that our employees have from the collective bargaining process. And most public employees are unionized, and so they will be represented by a bargaining unit. Those bargaining units then end up negotiating the terms of the contract with the agency, with administration, and the resulting contract, the collective bargaining agreement that comes out of those negotiations, will then stipulate various aspects of the job. So those collective bargaining agreements will stipulate, compensation and any increases in compensation, especially at the state and the local level. They will stipulate work conditions. They will stipulate evaluation standards and evaluation processes. They will stipulate sanctioning and disciplining types of procedures, training and development opportunities. All those aspects of the job will be incorporated within that collective bargaining agreement. Now, not everything, as we said, can be collectively bargained over, and the example we used was at the federal level. Compensation is not within the permissive scope of collective bargaining. You cannot negotiate and collectively bargain over compensation because compensation at the federal level is established by the Congress. Now, at state and local levels, compensation is the primary issue that is subject to collective bargaining, and it's well within the permissive scope of bargaining in the vast majority of states. Then we said, well, what happens when the two parties cannot come to an agreement? We talked about that's an impasse, and we offered up 3 ways to resolve an impasse: fact-finding, mediation, and arbitration. We said with fact-finding and mediation, those typically are non-binding. Arbitration, if you really want to come to an agreement between the bargaining unit and the agency, you're going to want to use final offer binding arbitration. Because in final offer binding arbitration, as we said, the arbiter comes in, looks at the final offer from the bargaining unit, the final offer from the agency, and then will pick whichever one the arbiter prefers or believes is fairer or more appropriate. And then both parties have to then be bound to abide by that decision that was made by that arbiter. So we have ways in which we can break these impasses. We said the upshot of all this is that a lot of agencies have now centralized the human resource management function in human resource management offices, because with the combination of all the stipulations and regulations in the career civil service, combined with all these stipulations and regulations in the collective bargaining agreement, it has become very difficult for line managers to be able to manage the human resource function. It opens up the organization to a lot of liability if your managers are not well trained on both civil service as well as collective bargaining agreement provisions. So just for reducing legal liability and exposure to lawsuits, a lot of these organizations have really centralized the whole human resource management process inside their offices of human resource management. So as we go through this process of managing our human resources, and again, we identified before that 85 to 90% of your agency's budget will probably be devoted to salaries and benefits. So will be consumed by human resource management. So human resource management is an extremely important function for public administrators. And as we go through this human resource management process, there are several different discrete functions that you will engage in managing your human resources. The first function, obviously, is recruitment. We have to go out there and identify potential candidates to then hire into open positions within our organization. Now, as you all know, if you ever applied for a private sector job and a public sector job, you know that the recruitment processes are much different between the two sectors. In the public sector, the recruitment process is much more protracted. It's a much longer process. It may take 6 to 8 months for you to get a position in a public sector organization, and it could literally take 6 to 8 minutes to get a position in a private sector organization. And again, the reason for that, private sector employees are what we call at-will employees. They do not have career civil service protections, whereas public administrators do have those career civil service protections. So we have a very regimented process we have to go through in recruiting and hiring new members of the public bureaucracy. We do a lot of targeted recruitment in the public sector as well. Again, social equity and representative bureaucracy, as we know, are two of the major values that underpin public administration. And so to try and enhance those values and to try and remain in accordance with those values, we will do a lot of targeted recruitment to try and enhance the diversity of our public workforce. And so we will do targeted recruitment targeted to certain venues that will help produce a much more diverse applicant pool. Typically in a lot of agencies, and this is true here at Cal State Long Beach as well, when you go out to hire, you put together your recruitment pool. So you send out your advertisement, your position description, you then have people apply. Before you can move forward in the hiring process, you need to have that recruitment pool approved by the university. And typically it gets approved by the universities. It used to be called the Office of Equity and Diversity. I think they've changed their name recently, but it has to be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. So the Office of Equity and Diversity will look at your pool of applicants and will determine whether or not your pool of applicants is diverse enough for you to continue with the recruitment process. If they do not approve your pool of applicants that's not diverse enough, then you have to go back to the drawing board. You have to go back out there and re-advertise and advertise at different sources using different advertising materials until you can get a diverse enough applicant pool to be approved by Office of Equity and Diversity. But it goes beyond just having the applicant pool approved by Office of Equity and Diversity. Once you've got that applicant pool, then it's time to go through that applicant pool and select people to interview for the position. And that moves you into the second function of HRM, which is obviously the selection function. So once you have your applicant pool and you then identify which candidates you're going to interview, then that list of candidates you're interviewing must then again be approved, at least for our department, not only by the Office of Equity and Diversity, but by the Dean's office as well, to make sure that the actual candidates you are interviewing represent a diverse cross-section of your applicant pool. Now, the way in which we've done selection really has changed, especially at the federal level over the past few decades. Back in the 1960s and the 1970s, selection was very much centralized, and especially after the passage of the Civil Service Reform Act in 1978, you have the Office of Personnel Management, the OPM, that was responsible for administering the examinations that you would use to select your interviewees. So there would be a standard examination that OPM would create. That examination would then be administered. You would then score the responses on that examination. OPM would then put together either what they call a rule of 3 or a rule of 5. The rule of 3 is they would take the top 3 scores on that examination, and those would be your 3 finalists that you would then interview as an agency. Sometimes they would expand that to a rule of 5, and you'd be able to interview the top 5 scores on the examination. But prior to putting together those lists of the top 3 or the top 5 scores, OPM then adds in what they call veterans preference. And so if you are a veteran of the military service, any of the branches of the military service, you get a certain number of points added onto your score to increase your score. It's called veterans preference. So they add on the veterans preference, and then either the top 3 or the top 5 scorers, those names are then provided to the agency, and the agency can then interview those individuals. But was a very centralized type of process. At the local level of government, in a lot of local governments, they use civil service commissions. And so counties would have their own civil service commissions. Those civil service commissions would create the examination, would administer the examination, would score the examination, and then provide the list of 3 or 5 top scorers to the agency for the agency then to interview. So typically at the local level, traditionally, it was a civil service commission that carried out the functions that the Office of Personnel Management carries out at the federal level. Now, as you're probably aware, we have moved away from the administration of examinations. Now, depending upon the position, you may still sit for an examination. It depends on how technical the position is. If you've got a technical, like a coding type of position, you're going to have to make sure that these individuals who are applying for the job can actually write code. And so you'll give them an examination to test their ability to actually do the types of things they need to do on the job. But in a lot of other venues in the public sector, when you don't have those specific types of skills that are required, in lieu of an examination, we oftentimes use what we call KSAs, stands for knowledge, skills, and abilities. So we'll do a more subjective evaluation of a candidate's knowledge, skills, and abilities as represented by their resume, their experience, the education they've listed on their resume, their references. We'll use that more subjective evaluation of their knowledge, skills, and abilities to decide who gets hired into these positions. One of the reasons why we have moved away from the use of examinations is that examinations traditionally have a problem with validity. And if you've had, most of you probably haven't had the 696 class yet, but if you've had undergraduate research methods, you're familiar with this idea of validity and reliability. Validity asks the question, does this measure what it is supposed to measure? Something is valid if it actually measures what it purports to measure. A lot of the examinations we are using lacked test validity in that they were not measuring the actual skills necessary to do the job well. There's a very famous case, we won't get to it here, you'll probably talk about it in 577, but the Duke versus Greg's Power Company case back in North Carolina back in the 1970s, where the examination that was being used for a custodial position was challenged as not being appropriate for that position. And what the company was doing is the company was using examinations for a custodial position that asked questions about, higher order mathematics and things that you would never need to use in this custodial position. And so what the court said is basically you need to have valid exams. And there are all kinds of ways to measure exam validity. There's face validity, there's content validity, there's criterion validity, there's predictive validity. We'll get into all of that when you get to 696. But for our purposes here in 500, it's just a recognition that these exams just were not as valid as we wanted them to be. And so we moved away from the exams to more of a consideration of knowledge, skills, and abilities. Another alternative that can be used in the selection process is what's known as an assessment center. And now assessment centers are good devices to use, but they're also very expensive. So in an assessment center, what the organization will do, the agency will set up a simulated work environment. They will then bring in their top candidates for the job and put them in this simulated work environment. And then they will monitor and evaluate the work they're doing in this simulated work environment. So you give them tasks that are identical to the types of tasks they will have to do if they are hired onto the job. So you get a lot more validity with an assessment center, but obviously it's very expensive because you got to put these simulated environments together. You oftentimes have to do it on a Saturday. You have to have people from the organization who are watching and monitoring and evaluating the simulated work. it's really a very expensive and resource intensive way to do your selection. So most organizations today use knowledge, skills, and abilities to screen their applicants to determine who to select and who not to select. Once you have selected the candidate and you have gone through the hiring paperwork, you hired the candidate then comes into the organization and then goes into that job. Once that person is working that job, though, that person needs to know what they are doing on a daily basis and what is expected of them. So as an organization, we have to engage in what's known as the evaluation function. So our third function here is evaluation. Sometimes people refer to it as allocation and evaluation. So we have to evaluate all the individual jobs within our organization so that we know what people are doing on a daily basis, and we can then use that information to then classify these positions into our step and column position classification system. Because once we have arrayed them in our position classification system, we then have the information we need to assign compensation. So the more responsible jobs that require more supervisory types of responsibilities or require more specific type of training and education, they're going to get classified higher and get compensated at a higher amount than a more lower level basic type of position. So how do we do evaluation? Well, the very first thing we need to do is engage in what's called a job analysis. Job analysis is when you look at each individual job within your organization and you deconstruct each job into its component elements. Now, you're not comparing jobs yet. You haven't gotten to the point of comparing, police chief to police captain. You're not there yet. But for each one of your positions, you deconstruct that position and analyze what the incumbent does on a daily basis, what types of skills and abilities are necessary to do that job well. One way in which we oftentimes do job analysis is we'll engage in what's called shadowing. So we'll have somebody from the Human Resource Management Office who will shadow the employee and will follow the employee through 1 or 2 days of work and watch what that employee does on a daily basis and how that employee goes about their work. We do that type of analysis for each one of our individual jobs, so we know what the true components of each job really are made of. Then, once we've done a job analysis of each individual job, then we move to the next phase, which is what's called job evaluation. In job evaluation, we will compare our positions to each other based upon things such as the amount of skill required to do the job, the amount of supervisory responsibility that that position has, the amount of effort, both mental as well as physical effort that gets put into that job on a daily basis, the work conditions, the conditions under which the work is being done in that position, and we'll compare all of our different positions to each other. One of the most common ways in which we do that is what's called a point factor job evaluation. And point factor job evaluations are by far the most common type of job evaluation that organizations do. And I will show you a real brief example of a point factor job evaluation as soon as we're done with our slides here. So hold on to that. I'll show you how that works. But essentially what we do is we measure the skills, responsibility, effort, and work conditions for each position. We will then assign a number, assign a value to each one of those different factors, and then we will weight each one of those factors as well. So, for some positions, the conditions under which the work's being done, that could be very important. Maybe you're in a position, if you're a patrol officer, for example, that position is going to be very dangerous. You're out there on the street, you're interacting with the public, so you have a lot of threat to, your life, and threat to life and limb. However, for a police chief, it may score very low on dangerous conditions because you're not really out there on a daily basis on the street patrolling the streets. However, in terms of supervisory responsibility, the police chief position is going to score a lot higher than the patrol officer. In terms of budgeting skills, that's going to score a lot higher for police chief than it will for patrol officer. And so you actually compare job to job in a point factor evaluation for the purpose of then assigning these positions to your position classification system. So ostensibly, the police chief job will come out with a higher score on the point factor job evaluation than patrol officer. And so it will be at a higher grade level and therefore be compensated at a higher pay grade than the patrol officer position. And that's what's known as job evaluation. And again, point factor evaluation is by far the most common way in which we do job evaluations. But then we have to memorialize the work that's being done in a job. And we memorialize the work being done on a daily basis in these things called job descriptions or position descriptions. Now, chances are in your organization, you probably have a job or position description that will describe here are the different tasks that you do on a daily basis. And oftentimes we'll then assign a percentage of time for each one of those tasks. So maybe 30% of your job is interfacing with the public. Maybe 20% of your job is handling correspondence. Maybe 20% of your job is working with members of city council. But we'll give you a percentage of how much of each day you're spending on each one of those different aspects of your job. And that's what's known as a traditional job description or traditional position description. A more modern type of position description is what's called an ROD, and that stands for a results-oriented description. So instead of just saying, this is what you're doing on a daily basis, and here's the percentage of time every day you're devoting to this type of aspect of your job, we put in there results, expected results for those activities. So if you are interfacing with the public, well, let's say you're writing communications, writing correspondence, and that's 20% of your job. In a results-oriented description, we'll not only say you write correspondence and it's 20% of the job, but we'll put in expectations for your performance. So all written correspondence will be absent any errors and will be completed in a timely manner. Maybe one of your responsibilities, if you're in a kind of a receptionist type of position, would be to direct people to the appropriate office when they come into contact with you. And so people are coming looking to go meet with people, you direct them to the appropriate office. Maybe the expectation is that you always direct people to the appropriate office without any mistakes, without any errors, without any customer or citizen complaints. But we'll actually incorporate your performance expectations directly into your position description. Now, obviously, that's a great practice because that then clues the employee into how they will be evaluated later on in terms of their performance. So a results-oriented description is a really nice way to connect job evaluation to performance evaluation. And again, job evaluation, performance evaluation are two different things. In job evaluation, we're comparing position to position for the purpose of then assigning pay grades and putting them in the position classification system. In performance evaluation, we're actually evaluating, obviously, the performance of the incumbent in that job. So if they know what the expectations are in their results-oriented description, there are no real surprises later on when we go and evaluate their performance in the performance evaluation process. Now, there's, I may have mentioned before, but there's a very famous article in Public Personnel Management by Charles Fox, I believe the gentleman's name is, and the title of the article is something to the effect of Performance Appraisals, the Keystone of Human Resource Management, something to that effect. Maybe referring to performance evaluations as being the keystone, just like you have an arch of stone, and that top stone in that arch is what's referred to as the keystone. And it's called the keystone because if you take that top stone out of the arch, the entire arch will collapse upon itself. So performance evaluation, according to Fox, being that keystone, is the most important stone that holds the entire arch of human resource management together. So when we go to evaluate an individual's performance, and again, that's important because we need to evaluate people's performance in order to ascertain, should they remain in the organization? Do they need training and development in order to do their job better? Do they need some sanctioning and discipline for their lack of performance? all those questions can get answered with a proper performance evaluation system. The problem with performance evaluation is that no one really likes to engage in performance evaluation. Managers don't like to evaluate their employees because the stakes are high. That if you evaluate an employee poorly, there could be some really negative aspects to that. That person gets a poor performance evaluation. It could threaten their continued employment with the organization. And so, for lack of a better term, managers don't like to play God. And so they don't like that aspect of performance evaluation. Employees don't like performance evaluation because oftentimes they don't like the negative feedback. And there's always that fear that even if you think you're doing a really great job, you're meeting all the requirements in your results-oriented description, there's always that fear that you're still going to get a negative or a less than positive evaluation. The problem is that when you get a negative evaluation, but you think you're doing an adequate or a good job, that creates this cognitive dissonance. And that cognitive dissonance is something that a lot of employees fear. So managers don't like to do it. Employees don't like to do it either. So how do we get around that in developing a performance evaluation system? We get around that through participation. We get around that by affording the opportunity for our employees to participate in the development of the evaluation process. So if our employees can participate in the development of the results-oriented job description, if they can participate in the development of the forms that are used in evaluating their performance, the more they participate in the process, the more likely they are to accept the end results of that process. So even if the results end up with negative feedback, they are more likely to trust that negative feedback as being accurate because they were involved in the process of putting this evaluation together to begin with. Now, there are several different ways we can do performance evaluation, and they're certainly not mutually exclusive. And the 5 I have listed on the slide are certainly not the universe of all the different ways that we can evaluate performance. But they are some of the most common ways in which we do it. So the first one is graphic rating. And you're probably very familiar with graphic rating. In a graphic rating approach, for instance, we can give a statement that describes the person's performance, and then a strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, or strongly disagree. Another approach is we can give a statement, and then instead of the strongly agree, we could have response categories such as always, sometimes, rarely, never. But we have those types of ordinal response categories that managers can select to then reflect their opinion about that statement about the employee's performance. Problem with graphic rating is that graphic rating leads to a lot of measurement errors. One of the most common errors we get with graphic rating is what's known as the halo effect. And the halo effect is where managers, just because they don't want to ruffle feathers, they want to keep their employees satisfied, they will always select the highest category for every statement, irrespective of whether or not that selection reflects the performance of the employee. It's called the halo effect because obviously if you select the best category, everyone looks angelic. Another problem, a potential measurement error with graphic rating, is what's known as regression toward the mean. And a regression toward the mean, the evaluator will just go right down the middle and will select the middle category for everything. Again, just because it's the easiest thing to do. It's quick and easy. So there are some measurement issues, obviously, with graphic rating, and you also don't get a lot of feedback as an employee. So yes, my manager agrees that I am always on time for work. Okay? There's not a whole lot of feedback there. My manager agrees that the quality of work I do is in accordance with my job description. Okay, well, what if they say they disagree with that? Well, why do they disagree? What am I doing wrong? What could I do better? A lot of that formative feedback you don't get from just using a graphic rating system. Another alternative is what's known as forced choice. In forced choice, we will, instead of providing strongly agree and those Likert ordinal response scales, instead we will provide statements as the responses. So you could say, the employee's attendance is, and one statement could be, shows up every day on time. Another statement could be, shows up every day, but is late 2 days, on average 2 days per week. And then they select whichever statement they feel best reflects the performance of that employee. The problem with forced choice is that if you don't provide the right choices, your managers won't be able to select the choice that best reflects the performance of the employee. So you have to be really careful how you design those forced choices. But graphic rating and forced choice, the main advantage is that they're quick and easy, and it doesn't take a whole lot of time to do those types of evaluations. A ranking type of evaluation is just what it sounds like, where you will rank your employees in terms of their performance. That's good for assigning compensation, but again, doesn't provide a whole lot of feedback. So I was ranked number 2 out of 30 employees. How far away am I from number 1? Or how much above number 3 am I? We don't know because there are no measurements between those rank order types of classifications. Usually for graphic rating and for forced choice and for ranking, we want to combine those with an essay type of section so that you can provide a narrative response as the manager to give that formative feedback to your employee. Now, the problem with an essay component is that our managers, their writing skills can vary greatly. And so if you have an excellent writer as a manager, you may get a flowery type of evaluation. Someone who's not such a great writer, you may not get as nice sounding, if you will, of an evaluation from that type of a manager. So it kind of introduces some of that subjectivity, but at least it provides some formative feedback. Probably the most advanced way to do performance evaluation is what's known as a BARS approach. And BARS stands for a behaviorally anchored rating scale. A behaviorally anchored rating scale. So in a behaviorally anchored rating scale, a BARS approach, what we will do is we will provide behaviors for each one of our categories so that when our employees get scored in a category, they're not just getting scored with agree or strongly agree, they're getting scored in a category with a specific behavior that they are exhibiting. So you can think of this similar to a rubric. So probably for a lot of your assignments in this program, I hope your instructors are using grading rubrics. Well, that's what a rubric is. So if you get an A on this question, on your response, here's the behavior that will lead to an A grade. Here's the behavior that will lead to a B grade. Here's what will lead to a C grade, and so on and so on. So it's a good way that you can provide that formative feedback by actually demonstrating here's the behavior that would be expected for a top score on this evaluation. So now the employee knows if they didn't get that top score, they didn't get it because they were not demonstrating that specific behavior. But now they know what behavior they need to demonstrate in order to achieve that top score the next time they have that performance evaluation. Well, the question then becomes, okay, it's great when employees are performing well, and it's great when they're getting these glowing evaluations and getting useful formative feedback, the process is working well. But what happens when employees get a poor performance evaluation? What do we do at that point? Well, if we were in the private sector, the employee could be terminated. You get one bad performance evaluation, you're an at-will employee, you could be out the door that same day. As a career civil servant, in order to be sanctioned, disciplined, or terminated, you need to have documentation. Your manager needs to have documentation of multiple poor performance evaluations. So if there's a poor performance evaluation, it's then incumbent on the agency and that manager to provide training opportunities to try and mitigate that deficiency in performance. So we identify where the performance is going awry. We then identify training opportunities and provide those training opportunities to the employee to try and rectify and remedy that deficiency so that next time they will get a better performance evaluation. Well, after you provide that training and development opportunity, if then the subsequent performance evaluation is still subpar, you're probably going to have to identify and provide some more and some different training and developmental opportunities. And you may need to do this several times before you are able to truly sanction and discipline an employee. But after multiple poor performance evaluations and multiple documented training and development interventions, at that point, once you've documented all of this, it's at that point that you are then able to either discipline the employee or perhaps even terminate that employee. So it's a misnomer that you cannot terminate public employees. That's not true. You can terminate public employees, but it needs to be for cause. It needs to be related to their performance. It will be governed by not only civil service regulations, but will also be governed by the collective bargaining agreement. And collective bargaining agreements are always very specific in terms of how you discipline, sanction, and unfortunately maybe have to terminate that employee. And so those procedures will certainly be spelled out. But typically what you need to do is you need to document multiple instances of poor performance and also document multiple instances of offering relevant training and development to help remedy those deficiencies that led to those poor performance evaluations. So basically, that's kind of going through the human resource management process. Obviously, when you get to your human resource management course, 577, you will talk more specifically about each one of these different functions of human resource management. But what I would like to do, let me stop the share. What I would like to do is show you some examples of things like a graphic rating system and a bar system, point factor evaluation. So you kind of can see what those look like. And these are all very simplified examples, and so they're not exactly the most technical in the world, but kind of gives you an idea of what these different things look like. So let me go and let's see, probably the easiest way to do this is I'll just share my screen, and I think that will probably work best. Let's see, well, let me stop that share. Okay. All right. Oh, there it is again. Let's get this done. Yeah, it's still going. Okay. Let me do it this way. Let me close out of that. Okay. Now, let's see. It's going to be kind of clunky because they're going to be opening up a lot of different things. So let me first show you a point factor evaluation. Okay, hopefully, do you see job evaluation point methods? Yes, hopefully you see that. Okay.
Yes.
Good, thank you very much. This is, again, a very simple example of a point factor job evaluation. So in the point factor job evaluation, again, we're gonna look at each position based upon the position's skill level, responsibilities, effort, and work conditions. You know this information because you got it from the preceding job analysis when you've done this for each of your positions. But for the job evaluation, then you're going to further define these things. So for skill, you're going to look at things like the experience level that's required for the position, the education level required for the position, the specific types of abilities and skills that are necessary to do the position well. You're going to look at your responsibilities, usually fiscal responsibilities. So do you create a budget? Do you have to manage that budget? Do you have to allocate fiscal resources? And your supervisory responsibilities. Do you supervise other employees? If so, how many do you supervise? How closely do you have to supervise those individuals? Another thing to look at from supervisory is on the other end, if you are being supervised by someone else, how close does that person have to supervise you? Do you work independently a lot, or do you work under very close management and supervision? The amount of effort put into the job, both mental as well as physical effort, the working conditions, where the work is occurring, how hazardous the work is, extremes in the environment in which you are working. And again, so if you're doing this point factor evaluation, comparing, for instance, a police chief and a patrol officer, you can see how those positions are going to differ greatly depending on skills, responsibilities, effort, and working conditions. Typically what you will do is you will assign scores for each of those indicators for both of those positions, and you will then weight each of those different components of the job. Once you do that, you multiply the score by the weighting. So you might get, say, an 8 out of, we'll say a 10 out of 10 in terms of your fiscal your fiscal responsibilities as police chief. Well, how important is that fiscal responsibility? You may weight that as a 20%. And so you take that 10, multiply times the 20%, that gives you the 0.20. And then you do that for each of those, add it up, and then the jobs that have the highest cumulative score, once you add up all those elements, those are the ones that are then placed higher in your position classification system and are then compensated at a higher amount than lower classified positions. Again, it's just this idea of a point factor job evaluation. Okay. Let me now show you, here's a graphic. Let's go to performance evaluation. So in performance evaluation, again, you're probably familiar with graphic rating. Again, that's the most common type of performance evaluation type of process. With a graphic rating type of system, it's what you're very familiar with. And so you have your different categories. Attendance, I know it's not easy to read, but attendance, behavior towards subordinates, sincerity, dependability, and then your ordinal categories. So poor, fairly good, good, excellent, however you want to arrange your categories. That's a graphic rating system. And again, the big problem comes in where you have managers with the halo effect who just give everybody an excellent score. And that's a common thing that happens in graphic rating. And then also, as we said, you don't get that formative feedback out of a graphic rating system either. So a more advanced or a better way to do it is a bar system. And that's this behaviorally anchored rating scale. So here's an example of behaviorally anchored rating scale. So the first indicator is acceptance of supervision. The incumbent willingly accepts and follows instructions given by the supervisor in the performance of duties, responds to training and coaching in a constructive manner. Here are the expectations. So if you're going to get a meets expectations, here are the behaviors that you may have to exhibit. Readily accepts and completes assigned responsibilities, attempts to improve performance following constructive criticism, follows policies set by supervisor without reminders, cooperates willingly with the supervisor, follows specific instructions. To get the exceeds expectations on this indicator of acceptance of supervision, demonstrate exceptional ability to independently complete assigned responsibilities, never complains about assigned tasks, improves performance following constructive criticism, knows and follows all policies set by the supervisor. We're not going to go through it all, but you get the idea. You provide these behaviors, and so that is the formative feedback that your employees then get incorporate within their performance evaluation. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of show you some of those examples so you can kind of really see what they look like. You'll talk about this much more when you get to human resource management, but going through those 4 functions of human resource management, the recruitment and the selection, the allocation and evaluation, and then sanctioning and discipline will consume a great deal of time within your organization. A lot of resources, a lot of energy go toward that. So much so that most agencies, as we said before, have really centralized the human resource management function with the professional human resource managers. And so because of that, we've seen a great growth in the size of human resource management offices and the need for people who are well-versed in human resource management. And I think that's why over the past several years, we have seen our certificate program in employee-employer relations grow greatly in terms of enrollment. And of our 3 certificate programs, we have employee-employer relations, we have a public management analysis certificate, and we have a fiscal certificate, public finance certificate. Of those 3, it's always that employee-employer relations certificate where we have the most students. And when I was chair, I think at any given time, we had anywhere from about 30 to 50 students who were taking that employee-employer relations certificate. So if that's something you're interested in, that certificate is available to everyone in the MPA program. It will not take you any additional time or any additional credits. We've built the certificate so that you can complete the certificate in the same 39 units in which you're completing the MPA degree. It just means that the courses you're taking will be a little bit different. So you'll have one additional required course, which is PPA 575, Employee-Employer Relations. Everyone has to take that in the certificate program. And then instead of having 5 electives, you'll then only have 4 electives. And those electives must come from courses such as our 571 Leadership course, 581 Government Community Relations, 570 Negotiating Dynamics. I believe the 533 Race and Inequality also is an acceptable course as an elective. So you just have to take those certain electives plus the 575 in order to qualify for the certificate. Let's see, where are we at? 5 o'clock. Are there any basic questions about human resource management, these 4 different functions of human resource management? Okay. Seeing none, I think this is probably a good time for a break, because now that we finish human resource management, we'll move on to our last topic of the course, which is managing fiscal resources. And this discussion on managing fiscal resources will then provide you with all the rest of the information that you need in order to do the final assessment. And so once we get through managing fiscal resources in the second half of class, you will be ready to do all the questions on the final assessment. So my clock says it's 4:56. Let's take a break until, we'll take a break until 5:10. Come back at 5:10, and then we'll move into our final topic of managing fiscal resources. So take a break to 5:10, and we'll be back at it at 5:10. Okay, it's 5:10, so welcome back. Let's do our last topic for the course, is managing fiscal resources. And so let me go ahead and share back out our slides, unless they've disappeared, which of course they have. So let me just share my screen and do it that way. Oh, that's right, I closed them. Okay, let's go back and get our slides again. And it's opening. Okay. All right, bear with me 1 second. Okay. All right, hopefully, just go this way. Hopefully you can see managing financial resources. Hopefully you see the slides up there. If not, let me know and I will troubleshoot it. But so for our last topic, we're going to talk about managing financial or fiscal resources. And as we know, agencies don't exist without financial resources. They have to have their appropriations, they have to have revenue in order to make any expenditures. And we have seen some prominent examples over the past few decades of agencies going out of quote unquote business because of getting zeroed out by Congress or a state legislature. One of my favorite organizations was the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. I know it's a mouthful, but it's otherwise known as ACIR. I've been around for about 35 or 40 years doing research in intergovernmental relations issues, relationships between state, local, and federal governments. Congress didn't like one of the reports that ACIR produced, and so in 1996, they zeroed them out. They took their budget away and gave them $0 to operate. Now, they didn't eliminate the organization, but they eliminated the organization's funding. And by eliminating the organization's funding, that was in the end of the organization. So money really is the lifeblood of public organizations. So we do spend a lot of our time trying to obtain resources and to efficiently and effectively manage those resources to carry out our daily activities, whether those activities be implementing policies or implementing programs. We need revenue, we need money to do it. So when we talk about managing fiscal resources, our fiscal resources usually reside in obviously what we refer to as budgets. And some of you may have some experience developing and managing budgets in your organization. Some of you may not. I know from reading the initial skills self-assessments, usually it's budgeting where most people don't have a whole lot of experience coming into our program. You'll get that experience when you take the PPA 555 Public Budgeting and Finance course. But most of our money will reside in budgets, and there are a couple of different types of budgets that we'll talk about in a second. But I think a good place to start is to define what a budget is. And I think when we think about budgets, we usually think about budgets as dollars and cents. And so we think about a budget, well, here's the amount of money we're spending, and this is what we are spending that money on. And at the very basic level, that is what a budget is all about. The amount of money you're spending, how much you're spending, and what that money is being spent on. However, whenever I teach the budgeting course, I also like to add a second definition of a budget. And that definition is that a budget is a statement of societal priorities. That if you want to know the priorities of a society or a community, you look at its budget. So if we are prioritizing education in a community, the education budget is going to get increased. And we're going to spend more on education than we may spend on other policy areas. So we spend money on our priorities. So a budget is a really good statement of societal or community priorities. And that's important because once we start defining budgets as a statement of societal priorities, it immediately increases the importance of a budget. Now a budget is no longer just dollars and cents, it's a statement of what we value as a society. So typically, especially at the state and the local level, we have two main categories of budgets that we develop and manage. One type of budget is called an operating budget. The operating budget is primarily for the day-to-day functioning of the organization. And so we're going to pay for our salaries and our benefits and our supplies. All of those expenditures will come out of an operating budget. But then at the same time, we also maintain a separate budget called a capital budget. And the capital budget will be for our capital improvement projects. So things like a new city hall, or a road reconstruction project, or a new elementary school. Those are all capital improvement projects that go into this capital budget. So the question then becomes, why do state and local governments maintain separate operating and capital budgets? Well, there are a couple good reasons for having a separate capital budget. One good reason is because most states have a provision in their state constitution that will preclude local governments from running a deficit. So every year, local governments must find a way to balance their revenues and their expenditures. The problem is, if you are going to fund a $60 million recreation center and you put that in your operating budget, that's going to blow a massive hole in your operating budget. And there's no way you're going to be able to have enough revenue to cover that $60 million expense. So these capital projects, which tend to be very high price tag, very costly projects, that also tend to be a long lifespan type of project, they're going to be around for decades and hopefully generations. Those usually get separated out into a separate capital budget. Another reason why we put these high price tag, long lifespan projects into a capital budget is because it allows us to be more rational in our decision making. So we go back to those 4 different decision making models. If we're going to spend $60 million on a new recreation center, you better believe we're going to want to take the time and consider all the alternatives very, very closely to be as rational as we can possibly be in deciding how to spend that $60 million on that recreation center. However, with an operating budget, when we're just talking about differences in salaries from one year to the next, or differences in the amount of staples we're buying from one year to the next, we can be very incremental. We can look at what we spent last year, add on a small cost of living adjustment, maybe 2 or 3% to keep up with inflation, and that's how much we spend in this coming year. So we can be incremental with operating budgets, and we can be much more rational, comprehensive with our capital budgets. So state and local governments usually maintain separate operating and capital budgets. The federal government does not. The federal government uses a unified budget. And one of the reasons why they use a unified budget is that the size and scope of the federal government's budget, where it's spending trillions upon trillions of dollars, one $60 million project or even 30 $60 million projects are not going to make a difference because of the enormity of the federal budget. However, if you're a local government and you have a $150 million operating budget and you need to dump a $60 million capital project in there, again, that's going to blow a hole in your operating budget. So state and local governments maintain operating and capital budgets. The federal government does not. It just uses what's called a unified budget. So what's the budgeting process look like? The budgeting process generally goes through the same phases, whether you're talking about the national, state, or the local levels. Now, obviously, things are far more complex. There's far more enormity, if you will, to the amount of money that's being done in the federal budgeting process, but the basic 4 phases tend to be the same regardless of level of government. The first phase of the budgeting process is what's called the preparation phase. And so we'll go through these phases relatively quickly because you'll talk about them again once you get to your budgeting course. But in the preparation phase occurs before the fiscal year starts. So at the federal level, the fiscal year runs from October 1st until September 30th. So it's not a calendar year, it's October 1st to September 30th. Here in the state of California, the fiscal year runs from July 1st until June 30th. So we usually have different fiscal year calendars than the regular calendar year. But at the federal level, in preparation, we're usually going to start that preparation process sometimes a year or more before the beginning of the new fiscal year. And in preparation, what we do is we do estimates of our revenue. We need to know how much revenue we think we're going to generate in the coming fiscal year before we can know how much money we have to spend. So we'll do revenue estimates, we'll do expenditure estimates. We'll ask the question, if we were to continue our current level of services in the new fiscal year, how much more will that cost us? Because obviously there are inflationary considerations. And every new year, you're going to have prices going up. And now obviously we've seen some major price increases because of inflation recently, but every year you're going to have those inflationary increases. So you're going to spend a little bit more each and every year just to be able to do the same types of services you did in the last fiscal year. At the federal level in preparation, we have 2 main organizations that dominate preparation. The one organization is known as the OMB, or the Office of Management and Budget. The Office of Management and Budget, or OMB. Oops, let me type that in, not misspell it. The Office of Management and Budget is the central clearinghouse for the executive branch budget. So for the president, this is the primary budget tool that the president can use. Office of Management and Budget will put together its revenue and expenditure estimates and forecasts. And then the counterweight to the Office of Management and Budget is an organization known as the Congressional Budget Office. And the Congressional Budget Office, otherwise known as the CBO, is the congressional arm of budgeting. So it's the legislative arm. So OMB serves the needs of the president for the executive branch. Congressional Budget Office does a lot of the similar types of revenue and expenditure forecasts and estimates, but they do it in the service of Congress. So they provide that information to Congress. Now, what seems odd to some folks is that the revenue and expenditure forecasts and estimates that we get from the Office of Management and Budget oftentimes look a lot different than what we get from the Congressional Budget Office. And the reason for that is they use different methodologies and they use different assumptions. One assumption that gets used in the creation of revenue and expenditure estimates and forecasts is what's known as the discount rate. And I won't get into a lot of detail on the discount rate, but essentially a discount rate is the rate that banks charge other banks to borrow money between banks. So it's not the interest rate that we pay, but it is the index that we establish consumer interest rates according to that discount rate. Sometimes we'll see the Office of Management Budget use discount rates upwards of 5 to 7%. Congressional Budget Office tends to use discount rates in the range of about 2 to 3%. So clearly, the discount rate that you use will have a big impact upon the results of your revenue and expenditure estimates and forecasts. So different methodologies will lead to different results. Typically, the Office of Management Budget, their estimates and their forecasts are usually much more optimistic than the ones used by the Congressional Budget Office. OMB is very optimistic in terms of the amount of revenue that they think the government will generate next year as compared to the estimates that come out of CBO. And the reason for that is because OMB is serving the president. And so OMB wants to produce these very rosy scenarios, as we say, to support a lot of the policy initiatives of the White House. But during preparation, you've got all this legwork being done in terms of revenue and expenditure forecasts and estimates. Then you also have OMB, which will reach out to all the departments and agencies and commissions across the entire federal government and will ask them for their budget requests. So every department, agency, and commission will put together a budget request. Here's the amount of money that we anticipate needing in the next fiscal year. They will transmit those budget requests to the Office of Management Budget. Once the Office of Management Budget receives those requests, they review them and they usually cut them. They usually reduce them. And so what we've ended up seeing is that a lot of these agencies and departments will ask for more money than they really need, anticipating that OMB will reduce their requests back to hopefully what they actually need to operate. That's a process known as budget maximization. And a lot of agencies and departments engage in that budget maximization. But OMB receives all these requests. They will reduce those requests and then compile all those requests into the executive budget. This usually all gets done before the State of the Union address. And typically, it wasn't this year, but typically the State of the Union address usually occurs sometime in January. Now, newish presidents oftentimes get a lot more flexibility in when they do the State of the Union. In their first year in office, it's not considered a State of the Union address because they're brand new to the office. In their second year, it is considered a State of the Union. So with the Biden administration, when Biden addressed Congress last year, it wasn't considered State of the Union. Now that he's been in office for over a year, this one that he just delivered was a State of the Union address, but it was delivered later than it usually is. It's usually delivered near the end of January. Then in the beginning of February, that's when the president then transmits their budget to Congress. That's when Congress then gets that budget. Whenever the president transmits the budget to Congress, we then shift from the preparation phase into the second phase of budgeting, which is formulation. Now, here in the state of California, preparation will occur sometime before January, and then in January is when the governor then transmits their budget to the state legislature. So at the federal level, formulation usually starts in February. In California, it usually starts sometime in late January. Once we move into formulation, this is where Congress or the state legislature then starts considering the president or the governor's budget. The way in which it works at the federal level is when the president's budget arrives in Congress, it immediately goes to what are called budget committees. There is one budget committee in the House, and there is one budget committee in the Senate. Those budget committees then have responsibility for passing this thing known as a concurrent resolution on the budget. I just left the T off budget, but you get the idea. Concurrent resolution on the budget. The concurrent resolution on the budget must be passed no later than April 15th. And yes, it's not a coincidence that it's on April 15th, the same day as income taxes are due. So it has to be passed by April 15th. The concurrent resolution on the budget will establish the maximum amount of money that can be spent across all these different policy areas. So here's the maximum amount that can be spent on education. Here's the maximum amount that we can spend on health and human services. Here's the maximum amount that can be spent by the Department of Defense. Here's the maximum amount for Department of Agriculture, and so on and so on. It's meant to try and impose some fiscal discipline on Congress through the budgeting process. So it's a very important document, the concurrent resolution on the budget. Sometimes you will hear members of the media on April 15th, once that concurrent resolution on the budget is done, saying, we have a budget. Congress agreed to a budget. No, they didn't. They're wrong. That's not the budget. That's only a resolution on the budget. Then the real work starts to begin in appropriation committees and subcommittees. The House of Representatives has an appropriations committee, and the Senate has an appropriations committee. Each one of those appropriation committees will have 12 separate subcommittees, and each subcommittee will work on the appropriation bill for each of their specific areas of spending. So again, an education appropriation subcommittee, a defense appropriation subcommittee, and so on and so on. So the job of each one of these subcommittees is to report out, hold hearings, and then report out an appropriation bill for their area of spending. Those appropriation bills then go to the parent appropriations committee. They're then reviewed and then changed, marked up, as we say, modified and amended, and then passed by the parent appropriations committee. And then each of those 12 appropriation bills will then go to the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate for discussion and passage. Now, we know from our reading of the Constitution that before any bill can go from Congress to the president for the president's signature, those bills must be in identical format passed by the House and the Senate. Usually the appropriation bills we get in the House look different than what we get from the Senate. And that's when we then move to conference committees. And the conference committees then have to hammer out the differences between the House and the Senate version. Those then bills, once they are uniform, go back to the House and back to the Senate for final passage before going to the president. That's what's known as the appropriations process. The appropriations process is used for discretionary spending. Discretionary spending is spending that Congress has direct control over. So there's a social services program. Congress says we want to save money, so we're going to spend $10 million less this year than we spent last year. They have direct control over it. That's part of the appropriations process. So anything that's discretionary that Congress directly controls goes through that appropriations process. So we'll end up getting 12 appropriation bills, hopefully, that will be passed by Congress no later than the end of the fiscal year on September 30th and signed by the president for the beginning of the new fiscal year on October 1st. So formulation will run usually from early February until September 30th. However, we don't only do discretionary spending. There's another type of spending known as mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is spending that Congress does not have direct control over. So something like interest on the national debt. Congress cannot directly reduce the amount of money we're spending on interest on the national debt. Once we issue that debt, once we borrow that money needs to be repaid with both principal as well as interest payments. So they don't have control over that. That's mandatory spending. It's outside of the appropriations process. Another example of mandatory spending are entitlement programs. So entitlement programs are programs where people meet eligibility requirements and are then legally entitled to benefits. So something like Social Security is an entitlement program. A lot of people don't think it is, but it is an entitlement program. It's an entitlement program because in order to get benefits from Social Security, you have to be, number one, vested in Social Security, and you also need to be of retirement age before you can get those benefits. You need to meet those legal eligibility requirements. If Congress wants to spend less on Social Security benefits, Congress would need to change those eligibility requirements. So increase the vesting requirements in Social Security, or increase the retirement age to receive those benefits. But they cannot directly just spend less money, because these people who are getting these benefits have a legal entitlement to those benefits because they meet those eligibility requirements. So Social Security spending, spending on certain social welfare programs that are eligibility based, that's all considered to be entitlement. That's all considered to be mandatory spending. Those mandatory spending programs do not go through appropriations, they go through an authorizations process. And there are another set of committees, authorization committees, that will review those eligibility requirements and make changes if necessary to those eligibility requirements. But hopefully by September 30th, all the appropriation bills and all the authorization bills have all been passed, signed by the president, and then we're ready for our new fiscal year with the budget. That never happens. That literally never happens at the federal level. Typically, when we get to the end of the fiscal year, there will be several appropriation bills that have not yet been passed and signed by the president. When that happens and we go into our new fiscal year on October 1st, those agencies where their appropriation bills have not yet been passed by Congress and signed by the president, they no longer have legal authority to spend money. So what Congress will do is they will pass what's called a continuing resolution for those areas. And that continuing resolution will usually say, for the next 2 weeks, we will fund this agency at 80% of what it received for the same 2 weeks last year. So we'll give it 80% of what it got last year for this 2-week period of time, just to kind of keep it operating and keep the doors open. After those 2 weeks expire, if we still have not passed the appropriation bill, then we'll have to do another continuing resolution, and then another one, and then another one, and so on and so on. Eventually, once we get into December and January, Congress will panic because they can't pass any more continuing resolutions, or the president has said that they will no longer support another continuing resolution. So at that point, what Congress does is, when it panics, it throws all these unpassed appropriation bills together into one colossal piece of legislation that is known as the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. I'm talking and I'm typing. The Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, otherwise known as an OBRA, Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. An OBRA will be, again, all these unpassed appropriation bills. But whenever you do that, you need to get enough support to get a majority in the House and the Senate to support this new Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. The way in which you get a majority of folks to support it is you put their pet projects in. So if you want this bridge named after you and you're a member of Congress, we'll put that bridge into the budget as long as you'll vote for the budget. And so this is where a lot of what we call our pork barrel spending occurs. Pork barrel spending is excessive spending that's done in congressional districts that will help members get reelected. It's called bringing home the bacon. So you're a member of Congress and you can bring all these projects into your congressional district. You can claim credit for them and they will help you get reelected. That's pork barrel type of spending. So by doing our budgets according to OBRAs, as opposed to the way in which the system's supposed to work, we end up spending a whole lot more money than we normally would have spent. But once we've got those appropriation bills, or that OBRA has been approved and has been signed by the president, we now have money to spend in this new fiscal year. And once that new fiscal year begins, that's then moving into what we call the execution phase of the budget process. Execution is when we actually go out there and implement the budget and spend the money. Now, it's also important to note that California, the process is a little bit different. So again, preparation goes until late January, when the governor presents their budget to the state legislature. Then beginning in late January, you move into formulation. And that's where the state legislature considers the governor's budget. But here in California, as many of you know, we have a little quirk in the system known as the May revise. And so sometime in the middle of May, around May 15th, the Department of Finance and the governor's office will reassess our financial situation and will reassess all those revenue forecasts that were used to create the governor's budget back in January, and will then revise those forecasts and those estimates. The May revise is extremely important because in the May revise, if we determine we're going to generate more revenue than what we thought back in January, well, then there are more programs that can be funded or more money can go into a rainy day fund. However, if our revenue collection's lagging and we're not raising as much revenue as we thought back in January, that's when we're going to have some cuts to programs and fundamentally change the governor's budget requests in the state legislature. So the May revise is important because it will change the way in which the legislature considers the governor's budget. Then here in California, by June 15th, 1 month later, the state legislature needs to pass the budget bill, and then that budget bill needs to be signed by the governor no later than June 30th for the beginning of the new fiscal year on July 1st. So execution then begins on July 1st here in the state of California. Now, oftentimes we will start the execution phase on July 1st without a clear idea of how we're spending the money, because a lot of the language that will govern how the money is being spent, that language will come in what are called trailer bills. And from July through August into September, the state legislature will be passing these trailer bills that will govern how the money is being spent and will provide the stipulations for what this money can be spent on and the reporting requirements for spending that money. So a lot of agencies don't know a couple months into execution exactly how to spend the money until they get these trailer bills out of the state legislature. But then during the fiscal year, you're in execution, you're spending the money. Once the fiscal year ends on September 30th at the federal level and June 30th here in the state of California, you then shift to your fourth phase, which is the evaluation phase. And this is where we audit. This is where we do some of those financial audits and some of those performance-based audits to ask the question, how did we spend the money? And that's what a financial audit is. Did you spend the money in the legally mandated ways that you were supposed to spend it? And then we'll also do management or performance audits, where we'll ask the question, how well did we spend the money? Did spending the money help us achieve our goals and our objectives? So that's essentially the way in which the budget process works. Not all budgets are created equal, and there are different budget formats or different types of budgets that governments can use for different types of purposes. The four I've listed on the screen are the four most common types of budget formats. I have provided examples of each one of these formats on our Beachboard site. I'm not going to go through them here tonight because you will go through them ad nauseum in your budgeting course. But if you are interested in what these different budget formats look like, you can go and see the examples I provided on our Beachboard site. But the first type of budget format is what's called a line item budget. Line item budgets are very simple. Here's the amount of money we're spending, and this is what we're spending the money on. So sometimes line item budgets are called object of expenditure budgets. So we're going to spend X amount of money on salaries. We're going to spend X amount of money on benefits. We're going to spend X amount of money on supplies. We're going to spend X amount of money on utilities. That's a line item budget. Shows you what you're spending the money on and how much money you're spending. Line item budgets are very good for control. They help us control our spending, but they don't provide us a whole lot of information in terms of how well we are spending the money. The only real information we have in a line item budget is how much we spent and what we spent it on last year. So line item budgets really lend themselves to incremental decision making. And using line item budgets explains why we tend to be very incremental in our decision making in budgeting. Second type of budget format is a performance-based budget. This is where we start to ask the question, how well are we spending the money? So what activities are we funding with this money? And then how are those activities helping us achieve our goals and our objectives? So you may have an objective in a police department to reduce crime rates, violent crime rates by 30%. Well, how are you going to do that? Well, one activity may be you're going to spend $35 million on increasing patrols. And so here are the number of hours of patrols that you are going to engage in with this $35 million. Then you look at the amount of violent crime rates, the percentage of violent crime rates, to see if there has been a decrease as a result of these enhanced patrolling hours. That's the idea of a performance-based budget. You're asking how well is this money helping us achieve our goals? The nice thing about performance-based budget is that it provides us with a tool to better manage our organizations, because we can see how well we are doing what we are supposed to do. The downside of performance-based budgeting is that it's more time and resource intensive to put together. Because in order to put together a performance-based budget, you are probably going to have a strategic plan. You have to go through a strategic planning process before you can put together that performance-based budget. The third type of budget format is what's called a program-based budget. And a program-based budget is fundamentally different than line item or performance. Line item and performance-based budgets tend to be organized around departments and units within the organization. So it would be the police department and the fire department, or maybe emergency preparedness department, and they all have their own individual budgets. In a program-based budget, we budget according to the program area rather than the individual unit or department. So instead of budgeting according to police, fire, and emergency planning, we may budget according to a program known as protection of persons and property. That's our program. Everything that contributes to that program will then be budgeted within protection of persons and property, irrespective of whether that's something being done by the police department or the fire department or the emergency preparedness department. It doesn't matter what department the spending occurs in. If it contributes to the protection of persons and property, it gets funded within that program. So the budget looks a lot different. That's organized according to programs instead of organized according to units and departments. The nice thing about a program-based budget is it serves as a good planning tool for us to use in our organizations, because it allows us to see how all these different activities across all our units and departments are all helping to further the same program goals. So one of the things we do in program-based budgeting is we engage in what's called a crosswalking process. And in crosswalking, what we will do is we will array all of our activities on one side of our chart. At the top of our chart, all of our different program goals. And then we'll link up this activity to this program goal and this activity to this program goal, and so on and so on. That will allow us to really get a good view of how our activities that we're funding with taxpayer money is helping us achieve all these different types of program goals. So it's very much of a planning type of document. So line item budgeting emphasizes control. Performance-based budgeting emphasizes management. It allows us to manage how well we are doing things. The program budget emphasizes planning, and it's a planning tool that we can use in our organizations. But again, the drawback is it's very time consuming, takes a long time and a lot of resources to do this. It will also require a strategic planning process. And sometimes we get a whole lot of pushback from executives in our different units and departments. So, the police chief may not like that their activities are being funded in the same category as the fire department. They want their own individual budget, which they don't necessarily get in a program-based budgeting approach. Then the fourth type of budget format is what's known as a zero-based budget. This also emphasizes the planning feature of a budget document. And in zero-based budgeting, we do not just assume that we're going to continue funding all the same activities year in and year out. We require that agencies go back and re-justify what they're spending their money on. The way in which you would do it in a zero-based budget is every what we call decision unit. So you look at your organization and you look at the lowest level in your organization where budget decisions are being made. The lowest level is then referred to as a decision unit. Each of those decision units will prepare a series of what are called decision packages. And I provided an example of a decision package on our Beachboard site. You can take a look at this week. But each decision package will present different alternative ways of funding this activity, and then the consequences of each of these different funding approaches. So we may say, we're going to fund, we'll say we're going to fund for a library, we're going to fund circulation services at 90% of what we funded it last year. Well, what are the consequences of that 10% reduction? Well, we're going to serve fewer people, our circulation rates will go down, may have an impact upon literacy levels in our community. Well, here's another alternative. We funded it at 100%, exactly what we funded at last year. Well, we're not going to be able to serve as many people as last year because the cost of doing this has gone up with inflation. So we may have a small reduction in our circulation rates. Well, maybe we'll fund it at 110%, so 10% more than last year. Well, we can serve this many more clients because we're funding at 10% more. Our circulation rates are going up by this increased percentage. Literacy rates may be positively impacted. These are the consequences for each of these different courses of action. So you may have one decision unit that could put together upwards of 2 dozen or 3 dozen different decision packages. All those decision packages then go up through the organization, then get reviewed at middle level management, get re-ranked and reprioritized, and then sent up to upper level where it gets re-ranked and reprioritized again. Your top ranked decision packages will then become your agency's budget. So it's a very bottom up approach to doing budgeting. Line item performance and program are top down. Zero-based budgeting is very much bottom up. Again, it's good because it emphasizes a planning feature. It makes us go back and critically examine what we're spending our money on and whether or not we should be funding these activities. The downside, very time and very resource intensive, may result in thousands upon thousands of pages of decision packages, and will take an inordinate amount of time for us to review all those decision packages, which leaves us in the position of we're always putting our budget together. And that's obviously going to be an opportunity cost. If you're always budgeting, you're not going to be able to go out there and actually create the output you need to create to satisfy the wants, needs, and desires of your citizens. But again, I've got those 4 formats up there for you to take a look at. For the final assessment, what's important is for you to have a general understanding of the advantages and disadvantages of each. Line item is easy and quick, doesn't give us a lot of information. Performance will take more time, will require strategic planning, but gives us a management tool that we can use to manage our operations to see how well we are achieving our goals and objectives. Program budgeting, again, very time intensive, resource intensive, needs strategic planning, but program budgeting will serve as a planning tool so we can see how all of our different activities are helping to achieve our goals and objectives. And then zero-based budgeting, probably the most time and resource intensive of all 4, but it is a good planning tool because it requires we go back and re-justify what we are doing every single year. Because zero-based budgeting is so time and resource intensive, when governments do zero-based budgeting, they usually do a modified version of zero-based budgeting. And the most common type of modified version of zero-based budgeting is what we call an 80-20 approach. 80-20 approach means that 80% of your budget will be budgeted in simple line item ways, and then you'll take 20% of your budget and subject it to a zero-based budgeting process. The next year, you'll select a different 20% to subject to zero-based budgeting. Then the next year, a different 20%, and so on and so on. So after 5 years, your entire budget has been subjected to zero-based budgeting, not just the entire budget all in one given year. It's just a little bit more practical way to do it with our limited resources. So those are some of the ways we put budgets together and the different types of budget documents that we can create. But again, at its very heart, a budget will tell us how much money we have and what we are spending that money on. So before we can actually make those expenditures, we need to be able to obtain revenue. As we know in the public sector, one of the most common sources for revenue in the public sector will be tax-based revenue sources. The three primary tax-based revenue sources we tend to use are obviously property, income, and sales taxes. Property taxes tend to be the primary domain of local governments. Income taxes tend to be the primary domain of the federal government and some state governments. Sales taxes tend to be the primary domain of state governments and in some states, local governments as well. Property, income, and sales taxes all have their advantages and their disadvantages. Property tax serves as a wealth-based tax. So with a property tax, we are basing someone's ability to pay the tax based upon the value of their property, and specifically the assessed value of their property. Assessed value of property is the value of the property that is subject to taxation. So whatever the assessed value of your property is, you multiply that times your property tax rate, and that then gives you your property tax liability. Again, property taxes are usually done by local governments. Good thing about property taxes, they tend to be very stable because property values usually do not go down. Now, we had that housing market crisis back in 2007, 2008. We actually saw property values go down. Now we're all painfully aware of just how much they've rebounded. And, it's usually with property values, you usually have this incline, this upward trend. So it tends to be a very stable source of revenue for a lot of local governments. The downside is that it can be very regressive, meaning that it can have a disproportionate impact upon lower income citizens. When you pay your property tax, you're paying it based upon the value of your home, but you may have inherited that home. And so you may have a small income level, but a very valuable home. Well, the problem with that is that if you have a small income level, you're going to be paying that property tax out of your liquid income. You're probably not going to refinance your property in order to pay your property taxes. So it can be a very regressive type of tax. Then we have the income tax. Income taxes tend to be more progressive because of the way in which they're structured. At the federal level, we have a marginal graduated tax system where we have different marginal tax brackets. So if you're making, $400,000 a year, you're not paying tax 39% on all $400,000 of income. You will pay 10% tax rate on income up to a certain amount. And then between that amount and the next higher threshold, you may pay 15% tax rate. And the next higher level may be a 22% tax rate. Those are what we call marginal graduated tax rates. The idea is that as you move up those marginal tax brackets, the percentages increase as well. So we are applying a higher tax rate to people who are making more money, people who have more of an ability to pay. The measure of your ability to pay income taxes is your adjusted gross income that you report on your federal income tax form, on your 1040 or whatever form you are using. So because it is a more graduated type of system with marginal tax brackets, taxpayers tend to view the income tax as being a more progressive, a fairer tax. So the difference between progressive and regressive. A regressive tax has a disproportionate negative impact upon lower income earners, lower capable taxpayers, if you will. A progressive tax will have a higher tax liability for people who have more disposable income. So as income levels go up, your tax rate goes up as well. The income tax is a very healthy source of revenue for the federal government. It's also a healthy source of revenue for the vast majority of state governments as well. Now, there are some state governments like Texas that do not have a state income tax, but the vast majority of states still will implement a state income tax as well. Some local governments also have access to income taxes. Now, not here in the state of California, but back east in the Midwest, a lot of local governments will have their own local income tax rates that they can charge citizens and workers who work in their cities. Then the third type is a sales tax or a consumption-based tax. Sales taxes are much different than property and income taxes in that property and income taxes are based upon an ability to pay principle. We determine the person's ability to pay before we figure out how much they owe in taxation. So in property tax, your ability to pay will be the value of your home, the assessed value of your home. In income taxes, your ability to pay is measured by your adjusted gross income. Sales taxes are not ability to pay. They are based upon a benefits received principle. We don't ask how much your house is worth. We don't ask how much money you make when we sell you that candy bar. You pay the sales tax based upon the value of that candy bar, the value to you of consuming that candy bar. If you do not buy the candy bar, you don't pay the tax. It's as simple as that. So it's very much of a benefits received type of principle. The problem with sales taxes is they tend to be very regressive. And that's especially true when you do not have what we call commodity exemptions. So a lot of states will have what they call commodity exemptions, whereby they will exempt certain things such as food items, things such as prescription medication. In some states, they'll exempt the first $500 of the value of clothing that you purchase. Commodity exemptions will exempt the staples of life from sales taxation because the idea is that people with lower income levels have less disposable income. They're paying more on staples of life than people from upper income levels. People from upper income levels have more disposable income. So if you can exempt those staples of life from the sales tax, you can take what is normally a very regressive tax and try and make it a little bit more progressive in nature. Again, sales taxes, the federal government does not use a national sales tax, even though every session of Congress, there are members of Congress who call for a national sales tax. Sales taxes are primarily used at the state level and then also at the local level with local option sales taxes. Here in California, we have local option sales taxes. We have Burns-Bradley Amendment sales taxes. And so depending upon the county you live in, you'll have a different sales tax rate. Here in LA County, we're close to 10% in terms of our sales tax rate. So most of our revenue will come from tax-based sources. But as a result of Proposition 13 in 1978, a lot of local governments here in California have moved from tax-based sources of revenue to non-tax sources of revenue, things such as user charges and user fees. Now, you're probably familiar with Proposition 13, but what Proposition 13 did is it limited the property tax rate to 1% and limited the assessment rate to what we say is 2%. Now, by assessment rate, we're talking about growth in the assessed value of your property. So the assessed value of your property, unless it changes hands, can only grow by 2% per year. And the tax rate that you pay can only be capped at 1%, but honestly, you're probably paying a little bit more than that. You're probably paying about 1.25% because there are some local add-ons for local bonds and levies and things like that. But the Proposition 13 limited the tax rate and limited the ability of the government to increase the assessed valuation of your home. That then combines to create a tax limit known as a property tax levy limit. You'll get into this more in your 555 class, but so it's known as a property tax levy limit. When you combine a property tax rate limitation with an assessment limitation, you get this thing called a property tax levy limit, and that's what Proposition 13 is. It limits the overall amount of property tax revenue that local governments can generate. So if you look at the sources of revenue that were being generated by local governments in California before 1978 and then after 1978, you'll see this pronounced shift away from the property tax because they were limited in how much they could generate thanks to Prop 13, and a movement more toward non-tax sources of revenue like user charges and user fees. A lot of governments will use user charge and user fee interchangeably. The fact of the matter is they are a little bit different. A user charge applies a charge to people who are benefiting from consuming a service. So if you're consuming a service, we can charge you based upon the amount of that service you are consuming. So, utilities, those are you can assign user charges for how much people consume in terms of utilities. User fees are usually not attached to the value of the good that's being consumed. Rather, user fees are usually attached to the privilege of engaging in a certain type of activity. So you want to get a hunting license, you have to pay a fee for that hunting license. You want to get a fishing license, you have to pay a fee for that fishing license. You want to get a driver's license, you have to pay a fee to have the privilege of having a driver's license and being allowed to drive on the roads. You want to open up a franchise, McDonald's or something, you have to pay a franchise fee for the privilege of opening up that franchise in that jurisdiction. But those are all non-tax sources of revenue that a lot of local governments in California have moved toward because of the limitations placed upon the property tax. And every year, the state of California, the California League of California Cities, does a study looking at the revenue distribution in local governments in the state of California. And what they have found is the typical city in California now derives more revenue from user fees and user charges than it does from the property tax. Now, your city may be a little bit different, but the average city gets more from user fees and user charges than from property tax revenue. When governments do not have enough revenue to construct a building or to balance their revenues and expenditures in a given year, they have to borrow money. And we know that governments borrow a lot of money, especially the federal government. It's very adept at borrowing money. When you borrow money, you are issuing debt. And oftentimes governments will issue debt and borrow money to offset a deficit between their revenues and expenditures. So there's a difference between debt and deficit. Deficit is an imbalance between revenues and expenditures in one given fiscal year. So if your expenditures are increasing are above your revenues, you're spending more money than you're bringing in a fiscal year, you have what is called a deficit. Deficits are prohibited under the California state constitution. So if you're a government and you're facing a deficit and you're constitutionally not allowed to have a deficit, one of the ways that we can avoid that deficit is by borrowing money. So you will borrow money, issue what's called a tax anticipation note. So say, for instance, your fiscal year is ending on June 30th. And when you're looking at your books, you're going to have a deficit. But you know you have property tax revenue coming in on July 15th. You issue a tax anticipation note, you borrow money secured against those revenues that will be coming in on July 15th. You then borrow that money, you apply it to your revenues, and lo and behold, your revenues and your deficit, your expenditures then balance, and you have avoided having a deficit and remained in compliance with the California state constitution. That's what's called short-term debt. Borrowing money over a short period of time, usually with a maturity of less than 1 year, that's short-term debt. Long-term debt, however, will be borrowing money with a maturity of more than 1 year. So this usually constitutes what we refer to as bonds. The primary way that state and local governments borrow money in a long-term type of method is by issuing what are called bonds. And there are a whole lot of different types of bonds that you will see in your PPA 555 course. One example of a very popular bond is what's known as a general obligation or a GO bond. General obligation or GO bonds will be secured with the full faith and credit of the government. So what the city will say whenever it issues a general obligation bond is it will say, we are going to borrow this money, but we will guarantee to our investors that we will do everything in our power to repay this debt. So if it means we have to raise tax rates, we'll do it. If we have to lay off employees to save money, we'll do it. If we have to sell buildings, declare buildings surplus property and sell them, we'll do that. We'll do whatever it takes to repay this debt. The nice thing about general obligation bonds is because you are guaranteeing the full faith and credit of your city, investors know it's very secure and they know they're going to get their money back. If you do any investing, you know that there's a relationship between risk and reward. The more risky the investment is for the investor, the more reward they're going to expect, the more return on their investment. The less risky, the less reward they'll get. And so if it's it's a less risky type of investment, like a general obligation bond, that means governments can pay a very low interest rate on that debt, and it will save governments a lot of money. The problem with a general obligation bond, though, is that you have to secure voter approval. And there are two different types of bonds. There are what are called Prop 46 bonds and Prop 39 bonds. A Prop 46 bond will require a 2/3 voter majority in order to pass that general obligation bond. Now, you can imagine how difficult it is to get a 60%, 67% approval from your voters. School districts here in California can issue what are called Prop 39 bonds. And a Prop 39 bond only has a 55% voter majority requirement to make it easier for school districts to issue these types of bonds to build new schools or renovate and modernize their existing school buildings. But most of the time, when we are constructing a building or buying a new fleet of police vehicles or a new fleet of fire trucks, that's a very costly type of capital project, and we're going to pay for it by issuing a bond. We issue bonds and we borrow money in the long-term type of approach for a variety of reasons. One reason is if you're going to construct a $60 million recreation center, there's no way you could raise your tax rates enough to raise $60 million in that first year of construction. There's just no way you can get your hands on liquid $60 million. It's just not possible. So what you do is you issue a bond, you borrow the money, and then you get that $60 million all up front once you sell that bond and investors buy the bond, and you've got the money to then construct the project, and then you can repay that money over a 20 or 30 or 40-year period of time. It's also a good idea to issue bonds when you construct buildings because of what's known as intergenerational equity. And intergenerational equity means that future generations will be using this facility. Hopefully this facility will be around for 100 years if you maintain it well enough. So that means you may have 3 generations at least that will be using this facility. So is it fair for the people who live in the city in year 1 to bear the entire cost of constructing this building? Or is it more fair to have future generations who will benefit from this building also paying the cost of paying back this debt? And that's intergenerational equity. So governments engage in a lot of borrowing of money. In order to borrow money at a low cost, you need to have a good bond rating. And so state and local governments are very, very concerned about essentially what is their credit rating. So before you issue a bond, you have to apply to one of the major credit rating agencies like Standard & Poor's or Moody's or Fitch's and get a bond rating, which will rate how secure the investment is and how financially able you are as a government to repay that debt. And there are literally dozens of indicators that these companies will look at to figure out what your bond rating is. The better your bond rating, the cheaper you can issue debt, the lower the interest rate that you'll have to be charged on that debt. The best bond rating from Standard & Poor's is a AAA bond rating. Not many governments have a AAA. A lot of governments do have a AA or a AA plus. And if you have a AA or a AA plus, you will qualify for the lowest interest rates whenever you issue that debt. But a major part of managing fiscal resources is just not generating revenue, but also borrowing money for a lot of these types of capital improvement projects. Debt is not always bad. If you're borrowing money to reconstruct your physical plant that needs reconstruction, that obviously is a good thing. If you're borrowing money to do road renovations, that's a benefit to your community. Where issuing debt is bad is when you're doing it to offset an imbalance between your revenues and expenditures. So if you're issuing debt to try and eliminate a deficit, that's a bad use of debt. So not all debt is bad. I think the moral of the story for the budgeting process, especially at the federal level, is that the budgeting process at the federal level simply does not work, or at least it does not work the way in which it is supposed to work. We're supposed to have all these appropriation bills passed and signed by the president no later than the beginning of the new fiscal year. As we said before, that never happens, literally never happens. Now, here in the state of California, we have a lot more success at getting our budgets done and signed by the governor before the new fiscal year begins on July 1st. And that's because of 2 reasons. One reason is obviously you have one-party control. So you have a 2/3 majority for the Democrats in the Assembly, a 2/3 majority for the Democrats in the state Senate, and you have a Democratic governor. When you have that type of one-party control, it's much easier to come to an agreement on a budget. So unified control helps you get budgets done on time. But also we made a change to Proposition 13 a few years ago, whereby we only now need a simple majority to pass a budget through the California state legislature. Prior to that, we needed to have a 2/3 a supermajority, and that made it extremely difficult even when you had one-party control. So today you only need a simple majority. You still need a supermajority to raise taxes and to raise revenue in that manner, but the actual budget itself only takes a simple majority. So we tend to do a better job in California than what happens at the federal level. But because of the dysfunctions, if you will, in the federal budget process, throughout the past 3 to 4 decades, we have tried again and again to try and reform the budgeting process. In the 1970s, we had this thing called the Budget and Impoundment Control Act. And we won't go through all the details of that. That's better left to your 555 course. But the Budget and Impoundment Control Act was all oriented around trying to get control of the process. This is where we created House and Senate budget committees. This is where we created the idea of a budget resolution to try and place a cap or a limitation on the amount of money that we are spending. We created what was called a reconciliation process and did a lot of things to try and change the process to impose procedural limitations on Congress to try and get Congress to get the budget done on time. It didn't work. Even after the Budget and Impoundment Control Act was passed, we still were not getting the budget done on time. We were still using omnibus budget reconciliation acts. It was a failure in achieving its goals. But we still have those House and Senate budget committees. We still have a budget resolution process. A lot of the things we put in place, we still have, even though they didn't work. Then in the 1980s, we shifted our focus. We said instead of focusing on the process, we should focus on deficits, because the federal government has run a budget deficit every single year between 1969 and today, with the exception of 2 years. There are only 2 years, 1999 and 2000, where we did not run a federal budget deficit. We actually had a budget surplus. But then September 11th came along, and when September 11th came along, it plunged us right back into deficit spending. But in the mid-1980s, we were very concerned about these deficits, because not only did we have deficits every single year, but every single year, those deficits were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So what we decided to do is to pass pieces of legislation to try and put limitations on the amount of the deficit we would tolerate each given year. The problem is that the limitations we placed on the amount of deficit we could have each year, those limitations were subject to congressional approval. So every year, whenever Congress would exceed that maximum allowable deficit, it would just increase the target. Then the next year, when they exceed that increased target, they'd increase the target again, and so on and so on. So every time Congress missed its target, it just changed the targets. So instead of reducing deficits, we actually end up with increasing deficits as a result of this piece of legislation known as Graham, Rudman, and Hollings. And you can see the 3 gentlemen that were named, the act was named after, Phil Graham, Warren Rudman, and Fritz Hollings, a Republican turned independent, and then a Democrat. So our attempt to try and limit deficits failed. It failed in 1985 with a piece of legislation called Graham, Rudman, Hollings 1, and then a subsequent piece of legislation in 1987 called Graham, Rudman, Hollings 2. So we get into the 1990s and we realize that focusing on the process didn't work, focusing on deficits didn't work. So we decided in 1990 to focus on spending. That if we could start capping spending and impose fiscal discipline in how we're spending money, that will help us avoid a deficit and will also help us get our budget done on time. So we had a big piece of legislation in 1990 called the Budget Enforcement Act, or the BEA. And again, the purpose of the Budget Enforcement Act was to place limitations on the amount of money we could spend in 3 different categories of spending: defense spending, international spending, and domestic spending. So we created 3 different categories, and we put what we call firewalls between those categories, meaning that if you wanted to spend more money in defense, you couldn't take from domestic and international to do that. If you want to spend more in defense, you would have to pay for that with cuts to other defense programs. You had to stay in your lane in terms of the 3 categories of defense, domestic, and international. It also introduced a concept that has come back to us in recent times, and that's what's known as pay-go. Pay-go was this very novel concept of pay as you go. That instead of borrowing money for new programs, if you want to create a new program, you would have to pay for it by eliminating or reducing an existing program. Pay as you go, kind of like what we do in our daily lives. Well, the federal government decided that they would impose that discipline upon itself. That Budget Enforcement Act, in combination with Balanced Budget Acts in 1993 and 1997, and a very quickly growing economy in the 1990s due to the dot-com boom and the internet sensation, ended up to a period of time when in 1999 and 2000, our revenues actually exceeded our expenditures. And we were finally able to get rid of deficits, and we were finally able to get our budgets done on time. But then, as I said, we had September 11th in 2001, and that completely reversed the process. We went back into deficit spending, and we've remained in deficit spending ever since 2001, and our deficits are continuing to get bigger and bigger and bigger. That basically means that the federal budget process is certainly still out of control. We're not getting budgets done on time, and we're also failing to match our expenditures with our revenues, and we're still continuing to run those bigger and bigger deficits. So what does this mean for the future? What it means for the future is that we're still contending with deficits, which means that we're still going to have some pronounced limitations on the amount of money we have to spend. We borrowed a lot of money to help pull ourselves financially out of the COVID-19 pandemic. Sent out a lot of stimulus payments. Those stimulus payments will have to be paid for eventually. And so our deficit continues to grow. So when your deficit continues to grow, it means there's going to be less revenue available for state and local governments. It means state and local governments are oftentimes going to have to start looking for their own sources of revenue, especially after a lot of the COVID relief programs have now started to expire. But at the federal level, we've always struggled with getting our budgets done on time, and we've always struggled with deficits. The state of California, we have fared much better, especially in terms of getting our budget done on time, and lately in terms of deficits as well. In that even with the COVID-19 pandemic, we have still been in a surplus spending situation. And so much so that we've been able to return a lot of money into the rainy day fund and also put more money into our different spending priorities. And so the picture is a lot better in California than it certainly is at the federal level. But this information obviously is going to be helpful to you on the final assessment, where you have to discuss different types of revenue sources and the advantages and disadvantages of those, as well as the 4 different types of budget formats and their advantages and their disadvantages as well. So I would certainly recommend to you, as you work on that final assessment, please do go back into our Beachboard site, look at those 4 different budget formats: line item, performance, program, and zero base. And I think that will give you a little bit more detail in terms of what those formats actually do look like. It's 6:21, and that wraps up all of the material that we typically cover here in 500. Sometimes we have time to do performance management, but since that's not reflected on the final assessment, I don't think there's any need for us to do performance measurement here tonight. So that wraps up all the information you need in order to do a great job on your final assessment. So in the moments we have left, do you have any questions or observations or anything on either management of human resources or management of fiscal resources? Again, the primary goal of this course is as a survey-oriented course. It is an introduction into the field of public administration. So we've covered a lot of different areas in public administration. Now at the end of the class, you should have a pretty good working familiarity with the role of the public service in our system of American democracy. You probably have a pretty good working knowledge of the development of the literature in public organization studies and those different schools of thought that we discussed. You should have a good working knowledge of the idea of public administration as a discipline and what makes it a discipline. You should have a good working knowledge of the whole idea of politics administration dichotomy and why that dichotomy is not a clear break and why that politics will always serve as a touchstone for administration. You should have a pretty good working knowledge of some of the different functions of public administration, such as policy formulation and implementation, program evaluation, managing human resources, and managing fiscal resources. And so hopefully what this information will do in this course is give you a good jumping off point then to move into your core curriculum of human resource management, organization behavior and theory, policy analysis, and research methods / program evaluation. I will get this recording up onto our Beachboard site by tomorrow morning, so you can feel free to go back and review it as you work on the final assessment. Again, the only two things that are left to do, your final Beachboard essay, which is due by next Monday, the 14th, and then your final assessment, which is due by midnight next Tuesday on the 15th. This is our last session, so no Zoom session on the 15th. Any questions you have as you wrap up your final assignments, feel free to send me an email, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. Okay. All right, if there are no other questions or concerns, I think we will call it an evening at 6:23. So thank you very much for being here tonight. Hope the class has been helpful for you. And as always, feel free to reach out to me, even after class has ended. If you have any programmatic questions or anything like that, I spent 10 years as department chair. So I'm more than happy to answer any programmatic questions you may have or career questions or anything like that. So just because the class ends doesn't mean I'm going anywhere. I'm going to be around for probably another, hopefully 10 or 15 years. And so feel free to reach out to me for anything that you may need. Okay, thanks a lot. Hope everyone has a good weekend, a good week, and a good remainder of the semester. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.